It's the lens, it's the lens, it's the lens, gotta live diverse. It's the lens, it's the lens, it's the lens, live diverse. You are listening to The Lens Living Diverse, a podcast brought to you by the CNIB advocacy team. Join Nisha, Vivi, and I as we speak to individuals with intersecting identities who live with sight loss as they share their unique stories. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of The Lens Living Diverse. I am your host for today, joined by my lovely co-host, Vivi.
Hi, everybody. Great to be back. Great to be with you, Ben, and super excited about our guest today.
Exactly. And our guest is a close friend, a work friend, I would say. Um, Once again, part of the advocacy and accessibility family, Steph Pilon. So, Steph, how are you doing today?
I'm well, Ben. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm doing great. And we're so happy to have you on the Lens Living Diverse. This has been months or even a year in the making.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're so glad to have you here. So, before we get started and we have an amazing conversation with you, Steph, we're just wondering if you could share some of your intersecting identities.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do identify as blind. I've been completely blind since birth. I do use she, her pronouns, so I identify as a woman. I am Caucasian. I'm white as far as my heritage. And I am also a member of the 2S LGBTQ community. I identify as pansexual or bisexual, depending on who I'm talking to. But generally speaking, I use the term pansexual when describing my sexual orientation. And I'm also a neo-pagan, so some people would consider that as far as intersectionality, as far as my religious beliefs.
I just want to say that one of the pleasures for me working on the lens is that when we work with the phenomenal colleagues that we do, we get to see how they are in a work capacity. And I often wonder what it would be like to have a conversation with them outside of work and to really get to know them and listen to their story and take a deep dive into who they are. And I'm so happy today that we get that opportunity with Steph because I have worked with Steph on a couple of projects and she is definitely one of the people who I would love to share a meal, a dessert, a lengthy conversation with. So I'm so pleased that she's able to join us today to do that. And Steph, I just wanted to start by asking if you would unpack the definitions of pansexual and bisexual for us a bit, just for our listening audience and also for me, who may think they know what those terms mean and just want some clarity on what those terms are, if you don't mind sharing a bit.
Absolutely. So these are terms that are kind of constantly evolving, and we all know that language, whether it's dealing with race, with the LGBTQ community, with gender, there's always kind of new terms popping up. So when I kind of first began to identify as a member of the community, I used the term bisexual, which was really common at the time, and that is basically and there are there are various definitions of this and various ways of looking at it, but the way I looked at it at the time is that I could be attracted to kind of either gender, male or female, and that was something that I identified with and understood. There are people who continue to use that term who may be attracted to people in other parts of the gender binary. So there are people who use the term bisexual who may be attracted to someone who is transgender, so who may not kind of fit into that male or female kind of binary system. And so some have criticized the term bisexual because it does imply that there are only two genders. And so that's kind of the big difference with pansexual. Pansexual very much is looking at sexuality as a continuum rather than kind of, either or, and so can be attracted to anybody along the gender kind of spectrum. So people who are who identify as pansexual may be attracted to someone regardless of their gender, whether they be male, female, or somewhere in between. So the pansexual, basically what that term does is it reiterates that idea that gender is a spectrum and that someone's sexual orientation basically could include anyone on that spectrum, if they identify as pansexual.
Thanks. That is very helpful to have those terms clarified. I appreciate that.
As Vivi was making mention, this is why it's so great to have individuals like yourself to educate the listeners as well as us, for sure. So, even making mention, so there was multiple different identities that you mentioned in your introduction. So I'm even just wondering, I like to ask the guests, like, did you ever find that your different intersecting identities clashed at all?
Absolutely. To back up for a moment, when I was younger, I identified as Christian and was very religious, and followed that particular path. And the path of Christianity that I chose, because I don't want to speak in broad generalizations, I do know that there are Christians that have a variety of political beliefs. So when I talk about the church, I'm talking about my experiences and the things that I saw, and not wanting to imply that everyone who follows this religion has these beliefs. So do want to kind of give that disclaimer. But one of the challenges that I had growing up was that my religious identity at the time made being part of the LGBTQ community very challenging. So there was a time where I had to kind of reconcile my sexual orientation and my religion, and I ended up choosing to find a different religious path, and that was my choice after struggling with that for some time. But that was a bit of a challenge. And then the other challenge that I've had, and this was more of an external rather than an internal kind of struggle, I think, was around my sexual orientation and my identity as someone with a disability, someone who was blind.
Mhm.
And the challenge here wasn't so much that I had conflict, but that society seemed to kind of feel that I had to pick one or the other. There's this kind of strange thing that society does with folks with disabilities, I think, where we tend to kind of, they have a disability, that's it, that's their identity, that's where it stops. And so there were times when I was kind of starting to come out and that kind of thing, where people kept questioning what I knew about myself. So I would say that, for example, I was attracted to women, and they would say, well, maybe that's just because you're blind. Maybe you're not really sure. Maybe you should think more about that. And so there was this kind of idea that because I was blind, I couldn't fit into that community. Even to the point, I remember I was in university and I was helping to run a pride group. And I remember being at a table, we were just giving out information and that with some friends and colleagues and that. And someone approached me at the table and basically implied that I shouldn't be there. So told me or asked me, do you know where you are? And I was a little confused. I'm like, in space, or what exactly are you asking? And they said, do you know what this table is? And I said, yes, it's, the Nipissing Pride. I was going to Nipissing University. The Nipissing Pride table. Would you like, a cookie? Would you like some information? And then said, well, to the person with me, how dare you corrupt the blind person? She shouldn't be here. So there was this kind of idea. And so I got a lot of messaging around that. So that made it a little bit difficult for me to unpack around my identity as someone blind, as well as my identity as someone queer at the time.
Yeah, and it definitely is a hint of ableism, like for someone who's able-bodied and part of the 2S LGBTQ community. It's almost like that was their choice. They know what they're doing, right? And that's a perfect example how it's just like, oh my gosh, you just don't know. Maybe you confused for a guy or whatever, and that's a prime example for sure. And
Yeah, that is a very disturbing story, Steph, I have to say, because it's like you were essentialized to your blindness, and the fact that you were literally blind, that is not able to engage with the world visually through the means that many people in the world do, that rendered you metaphorically blind or blind in other respects. And in addition, meaning that you had no agency because of this metaphorical blindness, meaning you couldn't even have the power to decide who you were attracted to sexually, or in some way you were mistaken because of your blindness, that you didn't have the authority to make these kinds of decisions for yourself, or in some way your blindness was the cause of you being misguided in your sexuality and who you were attracted to. And I find that very disturbing and disappointing, and just again, like Ben is saying, a way that people with the lived experience of disability are essentialized or rendered two-dimensional, and always in reference to the able-bodied world around them.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly what it is, Vivi. I think that people get stuck because the way that most people who use sight as, a very important sense that they have, when they think about attraction, especially initial attraction, I definitely, once you get to know someone, you're attracted to their personality, or you fall in love with them. But that initial attraction for a lot of sighted people is visual. And so I think that's where people get stuck around the kind of sexuality and disability, or particularly in this case with vision loss, that kind of intersection. People get stuck because they figure, okay, well, if you can't see, how are you going to know who you're attracted to? So of course there are other factors, as those of us who are blind, particularly those of us with no sight would know, or very little sight, that we, there are things about people's voices, we get to know people and then become attracted to them, and that kind of thing. And it's possible for us to tell, but there would be people who might assume that because we're not able to physically see the person, that, oh, well, maybe you don't know, and that's why you think you're attracted to women. And I think that's where they were coming from. So I understood where it was coming from, but it made it very confusing for me, kind of trying to figure out my own, how I felt about things when people were like, well, that can't be true. It kind of makes you question what you know in your own mind and heart to be true.
Right, exactly. In this hyper visual culture, right, it's all about returning the gaze. So if you can't visually receive the gaze, then you can't return the gaze, and then maybe you don't know who you are gazing at, which may present a problem for you, right?
Exactly.
So this you don't know who you're attracting, and you don't know who is attracted to you. But you're right, like there are other indicators other than the visual that we utilize to convey those same things and receive those same messages. It's the hyper visual culture that we're in that negates that, or doesn't validate these other means and methods of doing the exact same thing and going about the process in a near to identical way of finding and seeking and keeping a partner.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's a good old glance gaze, looking across the room. They look into your eyes, you look into the eye. I wonder how that would work with us blind folk, for sure. So I even, Steph, like you were making mention on kind of the perspective when you look at or kind of the outside world and those assumptions and those stereotypes. And in your own experience, and even maybe not perhaps even your own experience, but what you have seen, how would you find kind of the disability community looking at the 2S LGBTQ community, and even the other way around, vice versa? Like, what's your observation about that?
So an interesting thing that I have found in the blind community, and maybe it's just folks that I, came into contact with, is that there are people who are very religious within the blind community. And so that can be challenging when people do find out that you are LGBTQ. To this day, I have somebody, it was recently my birthday, and there's somebody that I know who is blind that I went to school with when I was in high school, who consistently every year sends me a message saying, "Jesus loves you. Happy birthday, and I hope you get healed from your, your." I can't remember exactly how he phrases it, but around basically your inappropriate sexual attractions, and it's like it's always kind of this thing every year, and it's like I always ignore it. But there are people, just as outside of the blind community, there are people who will judge kind of based on that. And the blind community, just as with other folks within our society, does tend to look at things from a very heteronormative kind of perspective. So just being at maybe events that had nothing to do with LGBTQ anything, and people saying, "Oh, if I mentioned a partner saying, well, what does he do for work, or where is he from?" And then having to kind of either choose to go with that, or to kind of course correct and say, well, actually, my partner is female, which then creates kind of this awkward silence. So that's kind of on one hand with the disability community, kind of in my experience. And then on the other side of it, with the LGBT community, it really does depend on the city, but in a lot of places, especially in rural kind of communities. And for context, I grew up in Northern Ontario, so fairly small communities. And a lot of the social events were, when I was growing up, and even as an adult, were very much focused around the bar scene, which for somebody totally blind can be a bit challenging, I find, to navigate. So things like being able to go in and, to a situation like this and find people that, you want to hang out with. Even things like being able to find the bathroom, right? If the music's so loud that you don't know where you're going, being able to orient yourself to the space, those kinds of things, it's really difficult. And then a lot of the ways in which things were and are communicated is visual. So I remember being in university, and there were posters up with Pride Week events, and so I needed to know who I could trust to ask what the posters said, because I wasn't able to read them. And this was also before the days of Seeing AI and Ira and those types of things, where I may have been able to bring up, but even to know where the posters were located, I didn't necessarily know those things. So it is very, very challenging to navigate these communities when you consider kind of other aspects of your identity. And I know other people have struggled with that as well, that I've spoken with.
Yeah, and I know when we were speaking prior to this podcast, making mention of a story utilizing orientation and mobility.
Yes. So one of the challenges with folks who are blind is if we want to learn, something new, we want to learn to access a new space, we may need help with that, depending on where it is and how familiar we are, and maybe how much sight we have and our comfort level learning these things. And so when I first came out in university, and I was really struggling, it was not an easy process for me. And I wanted to access, I was at the University of Ottawa when I began my studies, and there was a kind of a center. They called it the Pride Center. I don't know what they call it now, but it was for LGBTQ people, and it was on campus. And I knew it was on campus, and I knew there were signs indicating where it was on campus. But again, this was before the days of Ira and Seeing AI and those types of things, and so I did end up having to identify to my O&M instructor at the time that this was something that I needed help finding. And I remember being absolutely terrified to tell this gentleman that I was, I was needing these services and I needed help finding the space. And finally, I just kind of blurted it out one day, and he was fantastic. In his defense, he was like, "Oh yeah, no problem. I can show you where that is," and kind of calmed me down and was really, really good about the situation. But I have heard of other, kind of instances, people, and not even just in Canada, just folks that I've spoken to, whether it be in Canada or the United States, who are blind and who are LGBTQ identified, where they did not get such a favorable kind of response. So when they did ask for help, maybe finding a bar or a community center or something in their community that they needed in order to connect with the LGBTQ community, which is so important, to be able to learn more about yourself and be able to feel that you have connections and that you can kind of get more into the culture to be able to be part of that community, that they have been met with either flat out refusal to show them where those things were, or with criticism of, oh, well, you shouldn't be looking for that, or that's not appropriate, or, even giving people information on how they can, quote, change their sexual orientation. So, that is a challenge, an additional challenge that people face around, and it's so important. Anyone who's a healthcare professional, whether it's with vision loss rehab or anything else, just recognizing that that's a really challenging thing to have to ask somebody for you to be, basically coming out, which, I mean, coming out is a process. Everybody comes out lots of times every day, if they need to. But that is an additional kind of challenge, and that's not an easy thing to ask. And so being sensitive to that is just so important.
Very true. And it's almost a layer of another barrier to it, where you're making mention of that comfort zone and even having the risk of maybe someone judging or maybe someone putting their own beliefs or their own opinions. So yeah, definitely a layer that I feel like the general public don't really realize, or even the cross disability community and organizations don't really realize kind of falls through the gaps.
For sure. And I think a lot of pride organizations too, and I have noticed this more, usually in larger cities, but where there is like a number you can call to have somebody come and meet you, because accessing things like that, like, so if I wanted to go check out the parade, or I wanted to go check out an event, where they do have numbers now, a little bit more, that you can actually call and have a volunteer either, come and meet you or give you more specific instructions or that kind of thing. So I think we're learning in the LGBTQ community how to be more inclusive, but I do think there is some ways to go on that. And then same with on the disability side, recognizing that we all do have, we may have similar disabilities, but that we all have different experiences in terms of sexuality, in terms of race, and that kind of thing. And I think we're definitely on the right track, but there is some room to grow there, I think.
What I hear you drawing attention to is the need for community and, again, the choice to disclose. And it can be so difficult and challenging for people who are blind or partially sighted to find their community in the first place, navigating society. And the way you are focusing on the ways that things are communicated so that communities can be found and entered, like posters and bulletin boards and all of this visual rhetoric that is all around us that we can't access, which is difficult when you're a person with sight loss to begin with. But then to go deeper and have those be the primary methods to find a community within community, which would be the LGBTQ plus Two-Spirit community, that just adds another level of complexity and difficulty and makes the struggle at times even more difficult. And I really think it's important that we emphasize that and draw attention to that, because when you consider all of the identities, which is what we're all about here on the lens, it just can sometimes make finding that community more important and even more challenging. And then the challenge about disclosure, or whether or not to disclose, or even if you have the choice to disclose, which is what you were speaking of, Steph, when you, um, bravely asked for assistance from your O&M instructor and didn't know how that conversation would go, if he would be receptive, if you would get the resources, the assistance you needed, which are your right to receive, but to have to kind of expose yourself, whether you were prepared to or not, whether you want to or not, because somebody else then had the power to, assist you, which again is something, that makes me pause and really causes me to think about the privilege that some of us have that don't have to navigate that barrier, and what the power dynamic was in that moment. Unfortunately for you, it did work out, and you got the assistance and the services that you needed, and you were able to find the resources you were seeking. But I know you and I have spoken before that for some people who aren't in larger centers, who are concentrated in rural areas, this is maybe at times a life or death choice, and they may
Yes.
not be able to access what they need, as you were just saying, right? Depending on where you're located.
I don't know this kind of firsthand, but this is a particularly dangerous decision for our youth in the LGBTQ community who are blind or partially sighted, because there is a chance when they out themselves to someone in order to get help accessing services that they need, that the person that they disclose this to could turn around and tell their parents. And there are parents who are not necessarily supportive of their children who are in the community. And so, making sure too that when that disclosure does happen, that, that's where it stops, that, you tell your O&M or whoever it is that you need to tell, and that they don't turn around if you're under the age of 18 and let your parents know. And, I'm all for involving parents, but there are times in these situations where that can be a very dangerous thing to do. So it's just really important, especially for our youth. And there are people too who they might make that initial disclosure, say to an O&M or something like that, and it doesn't go well, and that could really be something that would be very difficult to get over. And I could see, it could be definitely life or death, because, if that's your last resort and you've tried and you were denied or you were told no, it can be a trigger for folks for sure.
And then we bring up issues of privacy and consent, right? And I know in the media recently there was a story about school board was saying that in New Brunswick, teachers would have to get parental consent if their children wanted to be addressed in the way they identified, rather than what their pronouns were at birth. And again, many students may not have come out to their parents and may only feel safe to identify with their chosen pronouns in school. And so taking this to another level, to the school board, who is then saying teachers must demand parental consent, opens up a whole other conversation about consent, privacy, the assertion of identity, your autonomy, how you choose to present and identify in the world. It's a very precarious and, again, could be potentially life-threatening conversation, and potentially life-threatening position that we're going to be putting youth in, that may not be, psychologically equipped to deal with all of this when they're trying to reconcile who they are anyway, right?
and they need time to figure it out. Like that's the
Yeah.
thing too, is that you know, most people that I've met, and I know for myself, there was a very long period of struggle before I told anyone else. And I can definitely say that my family was not kind of first on that list. Love my family. They are great, and we have, you know, kind of reconciled that, and they're kind of okay with it. They weren't so okay with it when I first came out, but they are now, for the most part. And that took a process to get through, but I wouldn't have been able to handle that process when I was first coming to terms with it myself. I can't imagine having to kind of navigate both those things at the same time. It's kind of it's a slow process for most people, I think, and for some, their family may be their first, the first people that they feel comfortable telling that. But I know for a lot of us, that's not the case, and so we need to do some exploration ourselves and within the community, and with our friends as well, kind of before we can feel comfortable saying for sure, you know, this is who we are and this is how we feel.
A great point that you brought up, and I'm glad that you made mention of your family and your coming out story as well, because uh, as we were speaking prior, you have a very unique story to where you were, like how you grew up, and then where you are now. So, if you could share, if you don't mind sharing a little bit of that story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up, my parents were French Catholic. So we, you know, we were for the most part Easter and Christmas Catholics, but they definitely followed more conservative values. My dad is military, or was, for many, many years. He's now retired. You know, my mom worked mostly in the home when I was younger, and they did have fairly conservative values. And then when I was a teenager, I became very involved with the evangelical Christian church. And my parents thought that was great. I was making friends. You know, I was getting out and doing things. So even though it wasn't exactly the same, you know, they were okay with the fact that it wasn't Catholic, but they definitely encouraged that relationship that I had with the church growing up. And so I was very, very kind of conservative in my thinking, in my views. And I decided, strangely enough, that I was going to go, and my thought process behind it was I wanted to work in the women's shelters. So I had finished college, I had my social services worker diploma, had done a placement in the shelters, which is what made me interested in continuing on with this kind of path of study. So I decide I'm going to go take women's studies and psychology at university.
Mhm.
And so I go off to university, and I go to my first, it was an introduction to what we called women's studies at the time. Now it's generally known as gender studies. And so I go to my very first class, and what happens, the teacher gets us to read an article on bisexuality. And I left the class and didn't want anything to do with it, because I was like, nope, can't think about this, because that was very much a part of my brain that I had tried to shut off. Any kind of idea that, yeah, I might be attracted to people of the same gender. I definitely had shut that down, because I was, in my mind, that was a sin, and you don't think about that. And so here I am in this class where they're wanting me to read all about like intersectionality and you know, things around particularly around sexual orientation was a bit of a trigger for me. And for whatever reason, and I still don't know really to this day why I didn't just drop the class and move on, but there were other things that interested me about the class. And I guess I was like, well, I'm gonna persevere and go through this. And the more I went through it, the more I realized that, you know, maybe the problem wasn't with me. Maybe the problem was
Mhm.
with my way of thinking. And so I eventually went to my professor's office hours and completely melted into a puddle. She was very kind. Um, and basically came out to her and told her all of the things that I had kind of experienced, kind of, you know, in high school, and trying not to come out, and just kind of basically gave her my life story. And she just said, well, you know, it's up to you what you choose to do, but there's no, you know, hard, fast rule saying how to do this. You know, you'll navigate this the way that is best for you. And I did. And, it took me time to come out fully, but the more I kind of got involved in the world of social justice and learned about different things, I not only learned a lot about myself, but I learned a lot about everyone else too. I became very interested in Indigenous kind of issues, and became really interested in learning kind of about the treaties and that on the land where I was. Became very interested in critical race theory and critical disability theory, and it was very interested in kind of having that become a big part of my my work life. So one of the things that was important to me around joining the advocacy department was the idea that it's important that people all have equal rights regardless of their intersectionalities and their identity as someone with a disability, but also their other kind of identities. So have always since then looked it took time, of course, to evolve, but began to look at the world in that way. And now, of course, I can't not look at the world in that way. But it was kind of an interesting journey for me, because that was definitely not where I started out.
Yeah. And we're so glad we have you in advocacy. We're like, about time. Like when you first became part of the advocacy team. And I like to joke around. We all joke around last time. I was like, yeah, you knew about DNI before DNI was cool, you know what I
It's
mean?
true. Yeah.
Yeah, before it was a thing. So it's so amazing to have you on the team for sure. And yeah, definitely. You offer so much, especially from the education experiences that you hold. With you making mention of your origin story, or no, not even origin story, just your story in general. You made mention at the top of the podcast about your conservative household. So how was that experience being a person who was part of the 2S LGBTQ community?
It was challenging. And I definitely became very aware once I realized that was that wasn't necessarily something that I was going to change about myself. Once I realized that this was how it was going to be, and that the best and safest way for me was to accept it, and to embrace it more than anything, I started to realize how very homophobic some folks were around me, and unintentionally so. Is in a lot of cases, not in all cases. There were definitely people who were intentionally homophobic. But I remember just before I came out, sitting with my parents, and there was something on TV, and it was two men kissing, and my mom saying, "That's disgusting." And I remember just kind of needing to leave the room, because I'm thinking, oh my gosh, if she thinks that's disgusting, what's she going to say when I tell her that her daughter is currently dating a woman? And how is this going to go? And it initially did not go well. My Actually, it was funny, because I thought my dad, who was very much, he was in the military at the time, was very kind of seemed more kind of conservative in his thinking. He was actually way more okay with it than my mom was at first. He kind of took a pause and said, well, I want you to make sure that you're sure before you start telling lots of other people. So there was this kind of caution on his part, like, well, maybe you're wrong, and make sure that you know what you're talking about before you start going around saying that to people. But he didn't kind of outright say, oh, this is wrong and this is bad and that kind of thing. My mom did it first. She wasn't happy with it. She kept saying, this isn't right. I remember at one point her quoting the Bible at me over the phone, and me hanging up on her. And we didn't speak for a few months after that. So it was very much a rocky road with them. Now, my parents, and I think they would be okay with me saying that they will never probably find themselves at a Pride rally. That's just not a place that they're going to end up. However, they do understand and accept that it's part of my life, and that I'm not willing to, or able to, or interested in kind of changing it. And they have come to accept that this is how it is. I don't know if I'll ever know really whether they're actually okay with it or not. But outwardly now, we do have a good relationship, and they do seem to understand. It was actually really funny. I went home, well, back to my parents. I don't live with my parents anymore, but my dog's vet is still there, and my dog, guide dog, had to have some teeth removed. So I went home with, or went back to my parents. I still think of it as home sometimes, even though I don't live there, but went back with my dog, and my partner, who is he is male, but he's very, very accepting of my identity. And I was wearing these shoes that were they were in the pride colors, and my dad says to me, "Those are really nice shoes. Where did you get them?" And he knew darn well that they were they were the pride colors, but he was just okay with it, and that was kind of his way of expressing that. So every once in a while, they're very they've come to accept it, I think. But I think it was a journey for them too, because when I first, and I think what it came down to is they didn't want my life to be any harder than it already was. They already knew that I was going to have lots of challenges because I was blind. And I think for them, it was just almost adding an additional challenge. So, even if they put aside their own beliefs, about whether it was right or wrong, and that kind of thing, even if they were to accept it on that level, there was this other level of accepting that, this might be an additional challenge for their child. And I really do think that that's where it was coming from, that it was coming from a good place. I didn't really see it that way then. It took me, growing a little bit more to be able to understand that, and their perspective on it. But I'm sure that's, now looking back, that's where it was coming from. I do believe that.
That's a huge, huge point right there. The fact that probably in some people's mindsets, it's that stereotype or it's that assumption that being part of the community is, oh, you choose to be a part of the community, right?
Yes.
And why are you trying to make your life harder? So that is a really, that's an epic point that really needs to be discovered for sure.
And I definitely had people outside of my parents. Definitely when I came out, I lost a lot of friends. I was very, very involved in the evangelical church. And for anyone who does, it's not just church on Sundays. There's church on Sunday, and then there's Bible study on Tuesday, and then I helped with youth group on Friday, and church again on Wednesday. So it was a very, very big part of my life, and it was a situation where people really did feel that way, that I could just pray the gay away and it would be fine. And I was not, I wasn't able to do that. And I think because, I was starting to get a really good education around, I just knew that that wasn't really possible deep down. I just knew that that wasn't going to work. And so I think I went to like one session, and then I was just like, nope, I'm not going to be able to do this. This doesn't make sense to me, because as part of my education at that time, I had learned kind of a little bit more about science and psychology and how things worked. And I just, even though I did have that part of my brain that was like, well, maybe that is what I need to do, I just knew that it wasn't going to make sense. It wasn't really going to work. And so I kind of gave it like a half-hearted try for a little while, and then was like, this is dumb. I'm not going to be able to do this. This is not going to work for me. And then just had to tell people, like, I'm sorry, but if you don't like this about me, then you basically are telling me you don't like who I am. And so I did make the decision to step away from the church, which was really, really challenging. But in doing so, I had more time for some of my kind of social justice things that I was becoming involved with, and I did make friends and found community elsewhere. But that was a really difficult transition for someone who had found community kind of in the church, and then had to kind of make some pretty significant life changes in order to feel comfortable with myself. I was very lucky because even after I came out, I wasn't living with my parents when I did, but a year or so after, I moved back in with them, and they allowed me to do that. Like, even knowing, but I do know people, both blind and sighted, who are members of the LGBTQ community, who came out and then they were told, "You're not welcome here. We don't have a
Yep.
son or daughter or child anymore." And so, I will say that out of the scenarios that could have happened, it definitely wasn't an easy go for me, but I've definitely seen worse, like that other people have had to experience for sure.
I know you spoke about the social justice
Yes.
aspect, and I really want to know how that transformed the way you look at life after taking that social justice course.
So I think for me with the social justice kind of aspects, I think what I really learned, and there was this, when I did a lot of, particularly in terms of gender studies, a lot of reading, you'd constantly see this idea that the personal is political. And that, everybody has a story and those stories all fit together. And that's how society, is the way it is. And I think I just got really curious about what other people's stories were and the different challenges that people faced, and just really wanted to learn about other people's stories. And so I did that. I read a lot, but also just kind of got involved with different things, wanted to learn about the experiences, of people of color in Canada, learned a lot about history, learned a lot about the history of disability rights, not only folks who are blind or had low vision, but around, developmental disability in Canada and how, in a lot of cases, people are still fighting for equal rights in those in those kind of areas of their life, as well as far as being able to make free decisions. A lot of my interest as far as social justice does go back to that intersection of disability and sexuality, because traditionally in society we really have, and this would be probably a whole other podcast. I could probably go on for an hour just about that, but around how we really have made it very difficult as a society for some people with disabilities, more so, some than others, but to have sexual freedom, to be able to make choices about who they, who they're with, and having the opportunity to have those kinds of relationships, and that we have, as a society, traditionally made it very difficult for people with disabilities. And because of that, I became very involved. When I worked for a while, I worked in group homes as a developmental services worker. And, I was the one, I was working with adults. They were all adults. They were actually in their 50s and 60s. They were older than me. And I was the person they'd come to, in a lot of cases, they'd be like, oh, we need condoms or whatever. And I was that person, right? I was always the person that was very comfortable with that. When I worked with children and youth, again, I was very, very conscious of, learning people's pronouns, of just respecting. And I think that's what it comes down to, is just respecting one another, and respecting other people's identities and autonomy, and that people know who they are, and giving them the space to figure that out in whatever way is best for them. And that was always my focus when I worked with kids as well. So I think it really just changed the way I looked at the world, and that I understood that everyone had a story, and that I wanted people to be able to express themselves in the way that was best for them, and wanted people to have the freedom to make their own choices and to live their own lives the way that they wanted to, without restrictions from society or anyone else. I mean, within reason, of course. But that people have a right to make their own choices, no matter what their kind of ability or what their story is.
Well said. Well said. So we are running out of time, and this is the part of the show that I hate because it's such amazing conversation, and then we have to like cut it off. But before we do you have any last parting advice, comments, anything that the listeners should think about, especially how you highlighted upon your journey, your story, and all the experiences that came in between from then to now?
I think just for folks who are, particularly young people, who are part of the LGBTQ community, who may be also blind or partially sighted, please reach out for help. And, if you are told no, or you are, maybe get a response that you don't like, please don't give up. There are people out there who want to help. and who can help. And definitely just keep reaching out, and you will find that person, and you will find your people. It might take you some time, but you'll get there. And it's just really important to hang in there and get the help and the support that you need. So definitely ask for that. And definitely, as far as I mentioned before around, healthcare providers, if you are somebody who's an O&M, or even just, people living in the world who interact with other people, be mindful of language, right? We tend to look at things in a very heteronormative way, and that can put people in very awkward situations. Even, I'm thinking, you're having conversations at work, and, talking about what you do on the weekend, and somebody mentions a partner or whatever, and making the assumption, that the person is of the opposite gender, trying not to make those assumptions, because it does make it harder then for people to backtrack, and having to out themselves when they may not want to do that yet, or for some people ever at work, or in a public context, and that's okay. So just, I guess, being mindful, and I think the bottom line is just respecting each other and each other's identities, and just taking time to learn about each other. It's such an important thing to do in order to make sure that everyone is able to feel comfortable and supported, and to find that community, which is just such an important part of being human.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, so much for joining us on the Lens today. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with you. I am so grateful that we were able to spend this time with you and just be receivers of your wisdom and your hopefulness, your honesty in sharing your story. Thank you for, your positivity in encouraging anyone out there who's struggling to keep reaching, keep searching. You will find the help and the resources and the people that you need. And thank you so much for your suggestions to all of us to just be mindful, thoughtful, and present when we are speaking with people, and just acknowledge what we are being told. If we are being asked to use pronouns, let's respect each other and use the pronouns that people are telling us they prefer. That small gesture can do so much to just affirm that we see you, we hear you, we validate you, and that in and of itself can just form a connection that can be so powerful with just this seemingly little gesture of affirming someone's identity and letting them know you accept them and you are open to having them present themselves to the world in the way that they choose. So thank you so much, Steph, for this conversation. And I definitely hope we can have you back.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, so once again, Steph, thank you for coming on the Lens Living Diverse. And once again, thank you for the listeners of the Lens Living Diverse. If you like today's fabulous episode, don't hesitate in subscribing to your favorite platforms, which include Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and many more different platforms. Also, if you are interested in getting to know more about diversity and inclusion within the CNIB, you could visit the CNIB webpage and click on Advocate, and then click on We Are CNIB. Once again, We Are CNIB. And lastly, if you are interested to be on the show or have any questions or any feedback you have for the Lens Living Diverse, don't hesitate to email us at advocacy@cnib.ca. Once again, advocacy@cnib.ca. So once again, thank you for listening to The Lens. I was one of your hosts, Ben, along with my wonderful co-host, Vivi.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Peace.